right, joining us now. She's a friend of the program. If this was SNL, we'd give her a Five Timers Club jacket for how many times she's been on this show. Our friend, a law professor over at the Baltimore School of Law, former U.S. assistant attorney. Now she's the author of a new book, Pardon Power: How the Pardon System Works, and more importantly, why. Kim Wehle joins us. Kim, Mike, and Nick, thank you so much for hopping on the program with us again.
Always a pleasure to talk with you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. We love your books here, and your books are very explanatory, and they break things down at a fundamental level. I think a lot of people don't know a lot about the pardon power. I was listening to one of your interviews recently on MSNBC of kind of like explaining, what happened in England versus when we came over here, right? And the Constitution and the democracy and the founders. So let's get into all of it. First, high level, what made you want to write the book? I know obviously the Supreme Court decisions of recent, and you've been writing, you wrote a book about the Constitution and why, but tell us a little bit about what made you want to write this book.
Yeah, so you mentioned the title has the and why. All of my books have the and why, how to read the Constitution and why, what you need to know about voting and why, how to think like a lawyer and why. And then this one, Pardon Power, how the pardon system works and why. And the reason to write it is because we're coming up on this historic election. And it turns out, as I've dug into the research, as you indicated, it sort of is at the intersection of everything we're debating right now. It is the power of the Almighty has no checks and balances, something more like an unlimited monarchy versus a democracy. It has this clash between mercy and corruption, right? The idea behind the pardon power is to exercise mercy for people that don't have a lot of a power in society, but it's used increasingly in a distorted way for corrupt self-interest, like we saw in the Trump administration, but also before that. So it also has, really interesting stories dating back even before the Bible. The entire Christian religion was founded on the denial of a pardon to Jesus Christ. The Romans on Passover had a tradition of allowing the people to decide on one pardon, and Pontius Pilate offered Jesus or a guy by the name of Barabbas who was convicted of murder, and they chose Barabbas for the pardon, and they said crucify him. So the pardon traces back to so many foundational notions, not just of government, but of religion, and really on, this kind of our consciousness or our conscience about how do we want to function as a community in the 21st century.
You know, I can't help but consider that, obviously the court had made that huge ruling recently about the powers of the president. How does that connect with the idea of pardon power? Because, what the court's ruling seemed to be, and I want you to correct this, of course, is that it sounded like there was like the boundaries sort of expanded for what executive powers a president has. Coupled with what we understand about pardons and how they work, does that precedent then expand what pardon powers can be? Does it potentially limit it? As in that reality, what stood out to you?
Yeah, I think the pardon power is now, the shotgun in the closet that presidents can use to really expand a criminal enterprise that the Supreme Court has greenlighted in the Oval Office. John Dean, who was White House counsel under Nixon, who famously told Congress there's a cancer in the White House, and was criminally convicted for his role in Watergate, wrote the foreword to my book and foresaw the immunity decision as having a potential impact here. He said if the court does give the president immunity on this notion of it, official power being above the law, that would have meant that everything that Richard Nixon did that produced his resignation would have been totally protected. I mean, that immunity decision would have changed the course of American history had it been in the Constitution, had it been in place prior to the Watergate, and it will change the course of American history moving forward. It just will. Why, Nick, is it so pernicious is, as I indicated, what the court held was so long as you used your official power, the stuff we really should worry about, the ability to command armies, the ability to direct the FBI to investigate or the IRS to investigate, the ability to initiate a criminal prosecution, just on the theory that we're going to bully someone even if we know we can't cross the finish line before a jury. So long as a president uses that kind of power, he or she is immune from any criminal oversight. But if he's going to use that power, say he wants to borrow from one of the progressive justices' questions, I might have been Sotomayor, say he wants to direct SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival. There's nothing in it for the American public. There's no public interest. It's purely to knock that person out of the race so a president can get a second term. It's just about amassing their own power. If he pulls out his private hunting gun from his garage, not the White House, then and shoots his political rival, then maybe he can be prosecuted once he's not in office anymore. But he's not going to be stupid enough to do that, particularly now. He's going to direct someone within the law enforcement apparatus to do it for him. That person is not going to be covered by immunity because they're not presidents under Article 2. But how can that president get that person to execute an illegal and unconstitutional order? You promise a pardon. And we know this has already been floating around. I mean, Rudy Giuliani reportedly was peddling pardons for $2 million a pop. 6 members of Congress, it's established in the record, asked or approached the White House for pardons in connection with January 6th. So the idea that give me a pardon and I'll be covered, I will get out of jail before there's even an indictment is already in our vernacular. And there are lobbyists in Washington that understand that. So you put pardon plus immunity is really a recipe for serious authoritarianism if it's in the wrong hands. And what I worry is that it puts a lot of pressure on voters to make sure they elect people with integrity. And we're racing to the next few weeks with someone who we all know, even those who support him, has no integrity. So that's not a good check on the worst instincts of a president, in my mind.
Okay, so as you just said that, there's a chilling effect that you just put on the table. And I want to expand on that for a moment because, we've been hearing a lot about the economy. We've been hearing most recently comments about black male voters, a lot of these conversations that come up. But it seemed like at one point, the concept of threat to democracy as a campaign strategy, for lack of a better phrase, was put forward by Democrats. And it seems to have been muddled by some of the messaging from Republicans, anti-immigrant sentiment, things like that. Kim, I know you've been on this show multiple times, and we've laughed a little about sort of doomsaying, right? But the reality of it, though, can you just refresh our memory of what's at stake from the standpoint of what you just said as it relates to when we talk about a quote unquote threat to democracy? As a legal expert, I look to you to answer that question. What's really on the table from the standpoint of our government, really, if this election goes in a particular direction?
Well, I like to use imagery when I teach. I teach law students, and everyone can imagine in their mind a regular triangle. That's an unlimited monarchy. That's King George III. If you've seen Hamilton, the musical, or you grew up in the 70s and remember Schoolhouse Rock and No More Kings. The idea was the king is at the tippity top of the triangle, and the king's power comes from God. It's a divine right. If you slayed your opponent on the battlefield, it's because God wanted you to be king, and so the king hands out goodies or punishments to those he favors. It's completely subjective and arbitrary, and you have no rights per se as an individual. The framers of the Constitution inverted the triangle. So now the tip is at the bottom, the flat part's at the top. The people have all the power, right? And the idea is that nobody has any divine right to be president. You don't have unlimited powers as president. You get fired or hired based on the people. That power is dispersed, but it's messy. To your point, right, Nick? We don't all sing from the same page. We're not all with the same backgrounds or ideals or religions or beliefs or all kinds of things. Democracy is somewhat messy. But to answer your question, what is at stake in flipping the triangle the other way around to a regular triangle, which really what the Supreme Court greenlighted, what is the vision behind Project 2025? Liberty means the ability to make choices without government bossing you around. Abortion, right? So you get to decide whether to carry someone to term, wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, having a gun or not having a gun. All this comes down to, government being a bully. But I'll tell you what I'm really concerned about. What does a loss of democracy mean? It means retaliation for your political views. It means I'm not on the right team that's in power. I'm not saying nice things about the king. The king has no limits. The king wants to stay in power. The king wants to silence people who disagree with the king or the president. So you start getting that power of government used against you perniciously. You start maybe getting weird emails from the IRS, or you start receiving threats, veiled threats. So then you're careful about what you say, right? You're not going to post that video. You're not going to send that email. Maybe you kind of shy away from a friend of yours who you love dearly, but doesn't share the political ideology of who's in power. When we start checking what we say, our speech, then we start checking our thoughts. And if you're worrying about what you're thinking, you're losing your humanity. I mean, it's not a slippery slope. If you can go into the public square and no longer feel that you can be or say what you believe, that's when we've lost democracy. And some will say, "Oh, well, that's okay so long as my team's in power." But if the structure's gone, someone else will be in power. You might not have a benevolent king. There might be now a wicked king that doesn't like your speech. The last king liked you, but this king does not. Then we lose ourselves. And I'll say one other thing: the experts in authoritarianism will say a telltale sign of losing democracies is degradation of the faith in our institutions. So what's happening right now with the lies around the election, what's happening right now with the lies around hurricanes, what's happening with the lies with not knowing what to believe is a degradation in the faith in democracy itself, in the Constitution itself. And that is a very, very dangerous place to be, because then the truth becomes the boss, the king, the president who has unlimited power. They dictate the facts, dictate the truth, they dictate how you get to speak and how you get to think. And I'll say one last thing. I have children. I have 4 children, one of whom cannot vote. So what we do in this moment is either hijacking freedoms and liberties to speak and think for our children, or protecting and preserving them. So even if you're like, well, I'm fine with right now, it stresses me out, I don't want to think about it, or I like Donald Trump. Think about your child who does not have agency in this moment to direct their own freedoms and their own future.
Like that. I mean, printed on a t-shirt. I don't know if it'll fit, Kip, but it's important and serious. And it's one of the things that when Nick and I started this show, we always said, at worst, we leave our kids something to listen to. At best, we've added to the discourse, and people are picking up on it, like we saw this weekend and we mentioned in the first segment. Kim, I did want to ask you, though, because you've been on the show a few times, and Nick mentioned the gloom and doom, and he kind of undercut me here, but I'm going to actually pivot it to the Supreme Court justices, because you've been very vocal on this show about the Supreme Court not seeing anything like this in terms of different decisions. And from somebody that maybe listens to this and is not a legal beagle, and they sit here and they go, well, I don't really understand that ruling or not, and maybe for us 3 here on this panel, we see 12 rulings in one direction and then one ruling in a different direction that kind of makes you go, is the court really this way or is the court really that way? So I'd love for you to kind of, Nick just mentioned about democracy and what's at stake on the November ballot, but from the justices level, right, from the judicial part of these 3 branches here, take us a little bit inside what you're seeing as a lawyer, what you're hearing from the legal community, what people can actually do. We know Supreme Court justices are appointed for life. So elections have consequences, obviously, but what can people do, everyday people do, about some of these rulings and verdicts? And what does Kim Wehle make of the way the Supreme Court has carte blanche so far over some of these rulings and what they've done over the last few years?
Well, I mean, the first step is to educate yourself, and that's why I've written these books, How to Read the Constitution, Why is Where I Would Start, and then certainly Pardon Power, the book that's out just in September. Because if you don't know how the car works and it breaks down on the side of the road, you can't fix it. You have to understand how it works. So you have to understand how our Constitution, our democracy works, how the Supreme Court works. And I really appreciate that question, because I think people say, well, are you picking on these justices because you don't agree with them? Right? That's not, there are split decisions all the time. What's it about this court? And I want to go back to that triangle. What are the checks and balances through the people on our judges. It should be inverted. There aren't that many on the court because the framers of the Constitution wanted federal courts to be apolitical, did not want them to worry about reelection on purpose. So they gave them life tenure. But there are limits. One of the limits is called precedent, or what we call stare decisis. The idea that you respect the judgment of the ages, you respect the judgments of your prior courts, the justices before you, even if they had a different political leaning, unless you have a really, really, really good reason. There's a multi-factored test before you reverse precedent, and they've ignored it. They ignored it with Roe versus Wade. They ignored it in blowing up what's called the Chevron doctrine, which was really a power grab. For now, the Supreme Court's made themselves the top regulators in the country. They've basically anointed themselves the power to make law. They don't have that authority. That's Congress that has that authority, and we can talk about that in detail. And I think people who don't understand that issue well would dispute what I just said. But I've been teaching administrative law for over a decade. So that's one thing. They've ignored that check. The other thing that they've ignored is something called Article 3 standing. The idea is judges are not politicians. If you want to change the law about guns, or you want to change the law about abortion rights, you go to the ballot box and you vote. But judges have to have people that are actually injured, that have something wrong with them, that they want the other side, if they sue, to make better by getting money or something. The judges are ignoring standing and taking hot button, culturally sensitive, ideological, political issues and ignoring standing doctrine. So they're ignoring the checks. The third thing is usually justices will allow decisions to percolate in the lower courts. They wait until the trial judge weighs in. Then it goes to the appellate court judge. And that takes a long time. And then you allow lots of parties to file briefs. They call them amicus, amici, friends of the court that have all different kinds of points of view. The court has been reaching into that process and plucking cases at the early stages. They've also been making major rulings in historic numbers without even having oral argument, without even having briefings. They're making constitutional decisions in one-page orders without any explanation. This court is drunk with its own power, and it is reshaping our Constitution. When you interpret law, that's like amending the Constitution. They're shameless about it, and they're doing it despite supermajorities who want gun control. Reasonable gun control. They are locking in the rights of guns, not gun owners, of guns. Supermajorities want women and girls who want to control their own bodies, to not have the government bully them as to what they should do, to make decisions with their doctors, with their spouses, with their families, with their religious leaders. They're not to have a bunch of legislators and politicians tell them that. Supermajorities, the Supreme Court's taking that away. The court is even poised to ignore something like the Supremacy Clause that makes clear that federal law is supreme. They're writing parts of the Constitution out of the Constitution, and they're doing it under the guise of textualists. The people on the right, the Heritage Foundation and others, the Federalist Society, have managed to dupe well-meaning, well-educated Americans into thinking these are conservative. They're not conservative. They're not reading the plain text. They're ignoring the plain text. There is no immunity for presidents in the Constitution. They made it up. They manufactured that for Donald Trump. There is immunity for members of Congress. The framers knew how to give immunity. They decided not to give it to presidents. So that's a long way of, weeks and weeks of constitutional law, where it takes me a long time to slowly persuade law students that this is an ambiguous area and they are not required to do what they're doing. They're doing it for ideological reasons because legally it's out on a limb in a lot of cases. Now, what do we do about it, Mike? That's very hard. Step one is to educate ourselves. Step two is really to elect members of Congress that are willing to do something about the Supreme Court. And sadly, even Democrats who've controlled the Senate have not found the courage to even hold hearings, real serious hearings on the conflicts of interest amongst, certain members of the court, Clarence Thomas, Justice Alito, front and center, call experts like me, Call Ginny Thomas's friends. Let's have the conversation and force the media to cover it. Just hold the hearings. You have that discretion in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and they haven't done it. So I don't know. I mean, run for office, you gotta we gotta engage, friends. I mean, I grew up in the Clinton era, and we just didn't have big problems like this. And I think we all got a little lazy and complacent about our own democracy. We've got to get our hands dirty. You got to get in the arena.
Kim, to that end of unchecked power, there was a recent story that had come out. I know USA Today ran it around the FBI investigation into Justice Kavanaugh, and it's been revealed from this report that there were restrictions placed by the White House on what the FBI could look into, and then in the end, Republican senators came forward and said, "Well, there was a lack of corroborating evidence, or the other version of this, to justify the lack of what could be found in that investigation." I bring this up to your point about unchecked power, and what risks do we potentially run of other justices potentially coming on? Obviously, there's only 9 seats, but people will retire inevitably. What are you seeing in terms of potentially the politics in the decisions of justices? Because I think a theme in what you've shared so far is politics are playing a larger role than really sound legal minds. Like, I mean, taking politics out of it. But from where you stand, what was your reaction to just that report, and any concerns you're having about potentially what precedents may be getting established for justices to get some kind of beneficial pathways to their seats?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, on the report, I don't think that, and just so people be clear, I used to work with Brett Kavanaugh, and back in the Whitewater days with Ken Starr. I have a lot of respect for him as a legal mind. At the time, we all knew that the FBI wasn't doing a thorough investigation, even of corroborating evidence. We all knew that the Senate pushed that confirmation through, and document dumped at the 11th hour, information that the Democrats could not have had the time to actually review. So I'm not seeing this as necessarily breaking, because at the time it was clear what was going on. Now, okay, so what are the problems with that? Number one, was Donald Trump ordering the FBI around? Sounds like he was, at least if you believe those reports. I mean, don't have personal knowledge. He is in charge of the FBI. He's in charge of the Department of Justice. Project 2025 has promised for him to use that to retaliate against people who his enemies, or people who haven't supported him. The reason there is a distance between the president and DOJ is because there was an understanding put in place after Watergate that we want that separation. It was a norm. It's not a law. So technically, Donald Trump didn't do anything wrong, but it should scare us. It should scare us that he's willing to do that, and it's a window into what a second Trump administration would be. I think the culprit there, again, is the United States Senate, right? The United States Senate should not have, frankly, I think should have gone to the next candidate. I think Brett Kavanaugh should have taken himself out of the process for the sake of the country, and gone to another candidate so that we could not create this chaos. No one's entitled to a job, period. No one's entitled to it. And that's my view on that. Part of the reason we were there, the last 3 justices that were put on the court, Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Coney Barrett, and Justice Gorsuch, were all put on after Mitch McConnell, when he was Senate Majority Leader, did away with the filibuster for Supreme Court justices. So they could be pushed through without having to get 10 Democrats to weigh in, right, and to approve it. With the exception of Clarence Thomas, that was quite controversial. Most justices prior to, the modern era were put on the court with supermajorities in the Senate and very little dissent. So this is new. This drama around the politicization of these judges is new, but there is also a lot of money behind it. And I encourage people to Google Sheldon Whitehouse, Senator of Rhode Island, his YouTube speeches and comments on this. He's done a lot of work on the amount of money that is now in Supreme Court races. So they have become politicized. So no wonder the justices are acting as politicians in robes, and trying to hide behind the historic legitimacy of the court to justify what are purely political decisions, I think, in certain areas of law. Other areas of law, they are operating just fine. But it's in the stuff that people care about that we're seeing, I think, political ideology. And even someone like Justice Kavanaugh, whom I said I have a lot of respect for as a jurist and a legal thinker, in my mind, is coming out with opinions that are not intellectually coherent or honest. If you're a textualist and originalist, then be a textualist and originalist, not just sometimes. And that's what we're seeing with most of the justices on the far right of the court.
Kim, I wanted to ask you here as we put a final bow on this, because we could talk to you all day, but we're not the Joe Rogan show and a 3-hour show, unfortunately. But I do encourage people, first off, go get your books. I encourage people, first off, if they're law professor students of yours, you do a great job. We know that already. But somebody that now is coming into a bookstore somewhere, they see this book, Pardon Power. You happen to be at the bookstore. I love asking this question to authors. Tap them on their shoulder. Explain to them right now, summarize everything that you just kind of encapsulated before about why this book is important, why it is important to understand these types of issues. So that way you don't complain about it later on to your friends or send nasty emails to two show hosts that host a podcast weekly.
Well, I'll just quote my friend Glenn Kirshner at MSNBC. I mean, he said it reads like a crime novel. You'll be amazed. I mean, this is this is why we have so many shows around crimes. The Pardon Power is forgiving crimes, right? And it goes back to the Code of Hammurabi. I talk in there about Lady Godiva and how if you actually locked eyes with someone who was perceived to be divine, you could be forgiven. We talk about go through the framing of the Constitution and the legal pieces, but also into the modern era. It's a mix of storytelling as well as a real in-your-face representation of what's at stake in November. And it's a fairly quick read, and it's written, as you indicate, for regular readers, not for non-lawyers.
That's perfect. And that's why we love those type of books, good explainers, right? As Nick likes to say on the show, a moment of literacy. Well, here's a book of literacy. You can go get it wherever books are sold. Pardon Power, How the Pardon System Works, and why. Follow Kim Wehle across social media, ABC News, legal contributor. Kim, thank you so much for hopping on the program. I truly, this is just me as a personal aside, as somebody this weekend that went viral in the right-wing media circles. I truly appreciate somebody stepping out there and giving their opinions about something, but yours is based in the legal system, right? Like there's a reason why it's blindfolded in the scales. So I appreciate you stepping out there, bringing in your personal story, but also writing these books and educating folks. Continued success to you. Please stay safe.
Same to you. Thank you, Mike. And thanks, Nick. It's been great chatting with you.